في ليلة من الليال لست أدري ما تراني ظلمة تغمرني أرى
الأرض ضاقت والسماء وقلبي ما عرف الضياء والدمع بات يبكي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي.
We're very honored to have both of our speakers, and Dr. Amr Abdallah, we're especially grateful to have, and not only because of his deep expertise, but also because of his recent new position with the Peace Institute at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. So if some of you have commuting jobs or family life, I don't think you can beat this gentleman as he commutes back and forth from Ethiopia now. And we're very, very honored to have him with us. Dr. Abdallah has helped us understand the importance of religion in peace building and in conflict resolution, which are specialties of his. Religion is sometimes an obstacle, but often a mask for underlying issues that are not religious, but also a resource at times for building peace in regions around the world. Dr. Abdallah's resume is far and wide and global. He's been part of Peace Institutes and Centers of Peace Studies in Latin America, has had contacts here with George Mason University, Eastern Mennonite University. We are simply deeply honored to have him be with us. You can read further about his bio, brief bio that's here, but I do want to welcome now Dr. Abdallah to the podium to begin our conversation about violence in the name of religion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goldman, and to the consortium and to the Hebrew Foundation for hosting me and Your Excellency. Really an honor to stand in front of you and to speak about this topic this evening. I have about 20-25 minutes to try to go through such a complicated topic. So to do it service, I will try to focus my discussion around the three specific elements that we mentioned in the brochure. The origins of violence, in my case, talking about in the name of Islam, the recent developments that we are seeing in this regard, and I will try to leave space also to talk about some positive transformations and the potential of such transformations. In order for me to talk about, okay, so what gives me any kind of credibility to speak about the topic? It comes from different dimensions. Of course, number one, I myself, I am from Egypt originally. I grew up in Egypt. I worked in Egypt as a prosecutor from 1978 until I came to the United States in 1986. There was something very significant about my work and career as a prosecutor. I worked in an office related to national security in Egypt, which dealt with espionage, with terrorism, and so on. And I joined that office on October 1st, 1981. October 6, 1981, 5 days after I joined that office, President Anwar Sadat was assassinated by members of Islamic Jihad. You can imagine how my life was for the 3 years that followed. I did nothing but interrogating members of Islamic Jihad, day and night, including some of the very famous names that you hear today, like Ayman al-Zawahiri and so on. The people that we interrogated at that time are seen by the current movements of radicalism and violence as the founding fathers of modern Islamic Jihad. So that encounter, firsthand, working with those people directly as a prosecutor, talking to them, understanding their own logic, was really the foundation for me to to try to understand how they think, what is the logic that they have for producing such violent doctrine and acting upon it. And I would say that that work actually is what led me to feel somewhat disillusioned with the judicial and legal work related to dealing with issues of terrorism. I came to realize that those people are not necessarily the evil, crazy. They're evil definitely in what they're doing, but to try to dismiss them as crazy and insane is actually doesn't help us. It doesn't help peacemaking. It doesn't help us to try to solve the problem. They are human beings like anybody else who are convinced that they are doing the right thing. And it's important in any conflict in the world, I don't care what level of conflict, to start with trying to understand the other side and to try to see where they come from in order to be able to resolve the issue, not in order to say, oh, they are right and I agree with them. And it became evident working with those people that they have a very strong social, cultural, religious, political motivation for what they are doing, and they are very convinced, especially religiously, that they are doing the right thing. And that made me realize that no matter how much we work from the legal aspect and judicial aspect and security aspect, we are unable to get into the bottom of this. It was important to try to understand all the different dimensions of their motivation. And I was lucky at that time, after 3 years of working directly with those guys, I got a fellowship to come here to the United States to study for 1 year. And I stumbled over the first program on peace and conflict resolution at George Mason University. It was just opening in 1983-84. And the focus of that program was to look at conflicts from all different angles: social, cultural, political, anthropological, and so on. And I thought, that's it. This is precisely what I wanted to focus on. It was that kind of understanding of those issues that motivate those people became such an important interest for me for many years. And I will say that when I think about the origin of violence in the name of Islam as we know it today, of course there are many scholars and academicians and practitioners who try to understand where they come from. Of course, the first tendency is to think that those people are doing this out of ignorance, poverty, illiteracy, no jobs, unemployment, and so on. And I found that actually none of those variables seem to correlate always with the tendency towards violence in the name of Islam. I found that the stronger variable that seems to exist, not necessarily in correlation with any of those developmental variables, is the understanding of their own religion and their own history on its own. That seems to be an independent variable by itself. What do I mean by this? For us to understand that, we must understand the notion of what I call the glorious past, or the perceived glorious past of Islam. Many Muslims, of course, as they recount their history and they think of what happened when the Prophet Muhammad came with the message of Islam, which of course we all know that it is not necessarily a message that was novel and new. No, it was connected directly to the messages of other prophets who came before him: Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and so on. And he came with this message to purify the message, the religion of Abraham and the other prophets in Arabia. He was a one man who started that mission on his own with his wife Khadija to start with. And he worked so hard in a community that was hostile to him to try to spread this message that is not only about the one God, but it's also about justice, equality, liberation, emancipation of people, and giving rights to the poor and the weak. It was a beautiful message, but it was of course challenged by the elites and the powerful ones in his small community of Mecca. He was persecuted and his companions were persecuted, and they struggled so much until they finally managed to leave that place of oppression in Mecca and develop their own community in another place called Medina, another town. There they had alliance with other people and they agreed to protect each other, and that's when they started their first Islamic or Muslim city-state, with the Prophet Muhammad leading it as a prophet and as the temporal ruler as well. During his lifetime, Prophet Muhammad, who started his message in one small town called Mecca, by the time he passed away, 23 years after he received the first revelations, he was able to take control of the entire Arab Peninsula, which is like now resembles what we see as Saudi Arabia and all the Gulf states. All that area became under his control religiously and politically. And everyone is giving allegiance to him, whether by becoming Muslim or reaching some form of agreement of supporting each other. By the time, 50 years after he died, there were successors who followed and continued the legacy of Prophet Muhammad. They managed to expand that new growing religion and growing, let's call it now state or empire, to reach over a territory going from Spain to India. Almost half of the known world of that time was under some form of control by an Islamic state. That legacy of what happened in those 50 years, and that continued pretty much to be a superpower in the world for the next 500-600 years. Of course, it wasn't just like one nation state covering all this whole area. The story was way more complex than this. And actually, it is that complexity that needs to be addressed more seriously and critically today. But if you take it just at a glance on the surface, then yes, they succeeded in very short time to establish control over this territory, establishing an empire and a civilization based on that religion. And that distinction of empire and civilization, in my opinion, is again very important to understand. Everything was going pretty much their way. They are the superpower, they are controlling matters, and but then, just like any civilization and any empire, they had to start to fall apart. 500-600 years later, the Mughals are attacking them, the Crusaders are attacking them, and many other attacks are happening, and they start to disintegrate from within, and like any other empire, started to fall apart. On the other side, the arch enemy that they had in Europe, the Christians, discovered the America. They reached the level of getting into the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and so on. They were having all those developments that were helping them to move very fast out of what was called the Dark Ages for Europe at that time. While the Muslims started to fall down and their civilization and empire is going down. And then there is the colonization and the exploitation of the Muslim lands by the superior Europeans. Many people say that when Napoleon came to Egypt about a little bit over 200 years ago, in the year 1798, it was a shock to the whole Muslim world and the Arab world, because they suddenly found themselves so inferior in front of a superior West. And that made them question themselves. What went wrong? That is really the big question that has existed in the Muslim world since that time. What went wrong? Once upon a time, we were a great nation. We were on top of the world. Our religion made us the masters of the world in 50 years. How come we disintegrated to that level, and now all those colonizers are coming and occupying our lands and taking our territory and creating Israel in the middle of us, and which became a big thorn in the heart of many Muslims and Arabs? The question was dealt with by a very simple logic, pretty much. That, well, we became so good and so powerful and established a great civilization of knowledge and ethics and also a good military power when we were good Muslims. But when we started to deviate from being good Muslims, then we lost everything. So the next logical question will be, so what do you need to do today? And we're talking about now the last 200 years, in order to restore that glory. Well, you need to become a good Muslim again, whatever that means. And this is where things start to go in different directions. Some people will say, you be a good Muslim by adhering to modernity and adjusting the way you understand your religion so that you can fit with the current time and modern time. But for other people, no, it means that actually go back to the true practice of Islam as we knew it from the Prophet and his companions. And you have a spectrum of different approaches to how to go back to become a good Muslim, depending on how you read the literature and the doctrine. And for some people, they argue that the problem we have that is holding us from becoming good Muslims are mainly two forces. Number one, our rulers themselves. In the Arab and the Muslim world, they are corrupt, and they are imposing on us the regimes that we live under, and they don't rule by Islam. Therefore, we should overthrow them. In addition, they are colluding with international powers in the West because of economic reasons, because of the oil and so on. And those two are making sure to keep us suppressed, and therefore we should also fight them. So the fight should go against our regimes that are oppressive and those who are supporting them from other places in the world. And that's when you start to get into the notion of the kind of militant fighting or violent fighting, and it is seen as a justified fighting against oppressors and against those who are supporting them. In the mind of those who are committing such acts of violence, they feel very convinced that they are doing the right thing as good Muslims because they are trying to restore that glory, which is their duty as Muslims, and that in the process they are fighting those who are holding them back. It sounds very logical from their point of view. And they find in the sources of Islam, the Quran and the practice of the Prophet, they find the foundation for that logic and why they think this is right. What helps them in developing that doctrine of what you call violence, two factors or three. One factor is true, there are true grievances. There are true injustices happening, whether because of the regime that they live under or because of the international interests of the international community. And in both cases, they are contributing to a sense of injustice that requires naturally for most human beings to react against it. That's one. The other one is the way they develop their doctrine and how they thought about what exists in their own religion. For those who become so violent in addressing those grievances, they rely on a methodology that has existed within the Islamic doctrine that we call it abrogation, or in Arabic, nasakh. According to that logic or that methodology, if Prophet Muhammad received revelations over 23 years, he was getting the angel Gabriel coming to him and giving him his message for 23 years. They argue that the earlier messages that came to Prophet Muhammad was about peace and non-violence and try to work out your differences with people. But later, as the community became stronger, the message became fight back those who are fighting you, and even fight in order to spread the message of Islam, and don't let anyone stop you from doing this. So, and those are different shades of what we will call jihad in the militant sense. Some people will see jihad as a matter of self-defense. Others will see, no, jihad is a matter of trying to force Islam or to spread Islam because that was the last message came to Prophet Muhammad. I see that that is one dangerous slope that we have methodologically that is forcing us to dismiss 90% of what's in the Quran and what's in the sources of Islam in order to maintain only 2-3 verses that are controversial, and taking them out of context and say that's what Islam is about. Keep fighting those people because they are bad people, or keep fighting them because you need to fight them to make them Muslims like you. That's a big problem. And of course, this is not, the good news is this is not the only way to interpret things in Islam, but there are definitely other ways of interpreting that are more contextual, that are more harmonious with living with other people, respecting other people's rights, and respecting that people will be different forever, and that this is the plan that God has mandated for the universe. And it is those differences in terms of doctrine that shape some of this thinking. I go back to say and insist, and I know some people may disagree with me, that internal logic within many Muslims that is based on I have a duty as a Muslim to restore the glorious past, and I do that against the forces that are holding me back, namely our regimes and also the international powers that are supporting them, is a very internal logic that is not dependent on if you are poor, you don't have a job, and we have the empirical evidence. When you look at those who committed the act of September 11, 19 of them, education, all of them are educated. Well off, 15 of them were from Saudi Arabia. which pretty much means that it's not necessarily they were poor people who are starving. Poverty has not really correlated. Lack of actual education correlates the opposite way. Actually, most of those people who are members of violent Islamic groups are actually well educated. And I can give you a short vignette on this. When I worked as a prosecutor in Egypt, and in my first 3 years I worked in one of the districts of Cairo, and almost all my clients, the criminals who came for interrogations, they were thieves and robbers and rapists and so on. And almost none of them could read or write, to the point that every prosecutor had to have a rubber stamp on his desk to get people to put their thumb and then stamp it at the bottom of the interrogation report. When I went to the Office of National Security and I started to interrogate all those Islamic Jihad people, I never used that rubber stamp because all of them could read and write their name very well. And they were mainly with college degrees and higher. So I want to say again that the point about the origin that I want to emphasize here is that the origin comes from that notion of the glorious past and the duty to restore it, faced by sense of grievance because of so many factors happening around us. What made things more complicated in the last 40, 50 years? Because I would say that phenomena of Islamic militancy and violence, the way we see it today, and the way we have seen it in the last 20 years or so, is new. It wasn't like this in the 40s, 50s, or 60s. Yes, you had some elements of violence here or there, but nothing like what we have seen with Al-Qaeda or now ISIS. Many factors contribute to this. And I would say that for those who are interested in historical research, one important year to focus on is the year 1979. Because in the year 1979, you had so many things happen that seemed to collude to result in this new phenomena of modern Islamic or Islam-based or faith-branded violence. You had the Iranian Revolution, which was a historical revolution. Everyone at that time was only thinking that if there is a revolution, it will be either a revolution towards communism or socialism, or a revolution to restore back democracy and free market. You either go in the camp of the United States or you go in the camp of the Soviet Union. That was the only game in town. But then suddenly the Iranians come with this new revolution that is bringing back an Islamic state. It was a shock to the whole world, and many people thought that it was something just like extraordinary, it will disappear on its own. But here, 40, 50 years after, it's still there. And on top of that, you had the invasion of the Soviet Union into Afghanistan. And that invasion, of course, being a significant event for international relations and economic interest, what it resulted in is it created fear for the people who are in control of the oil in the Gulf states and to the international market. So they were afraid of the Soviet Union getting their hand on the oil in the Gulf states now that they are so close in Afghanistan. Also very scared of Iran becoming Islamic and saying that we're going to export our revolution to the oil states. With this happening, especially the United States government decided that the smartest way to fight those two was, number one, to unleash Saddam Hussein against Iran and let him get busy in a war for 8 years, which happened. And for the Soviet Unions, they are infidels, they don't believe in God, so get them the jihadists who are harassing the regimes in the Arab world and just killed Anwar Sadat in 81, send them to Afghanistan, give them the weapons paid by the Saudis in order to fight against the Soviet Union. And that worked very well, and they succeeded in pushing the Soviet Union out, and eventually for the Soviet Union to collapse. But the problem with trying to manipulate this force called militant Islam is it is like a genie in a bottle. You get it out, you unleash that genie out of the bottle thinking that it's going to do the good work for you, and when it finishes the work you say, okay, back in your bottle, genie. The genie doesn't go back in the bottle. This is the problem, and it starts to lash out in different directions. And that's what we are living with today. I wish I had more time to go into what's happening today with ISIS and so on, but I can say that it is a series of mistakes happening internationally by different actors and different decision makers who don't understand that phenomena of violence in the name of Islam that is making it grow and grow out of control. Are we seeing just a dark picture and we don't see any hope in the future? No, I think there is a glimpse of hope. And that glimpse of hope, to my surprise, came from who? It came from those very same people I mentioned that I prosecuted, among other, my team of prosecutors in 1981, 82, 83. The leaders of Islamic Jihad at that time who killed Anwar Sadat, who thought that they were doing the right thing, and they were so proud of what they did by killing Sadat and killing different people. After spending long years in prison, they started to actually re-examine the doctrine that they had established to justify the killing of Anwar Sadat and to try to restore what they called the Islamic State. And by doing this, they actually discovered that their doctrine was wrong. And they started to develop a new doctrine. And that whole process in Arabic was called al-muraja'at al-fiqhiyya, and which means in English pretty much doctrine revisions. They revised the doctrine that they had established to justify the killing and the violence, and they recognized that they were wrong, and they developed an alternative doctrine based on means of non-violence, not losing sight of the grievances and the injustice that they recognize, but also developing methods that are less violent, more peaceful for how to deal with such grievances. They have books already published, available free online. All of them until now are in Arabic. They did such a good job with this work that the government in Egypt in the 1990s took them to different prisons in order to spread that new doctrine. And they were successful in actually reforming or transforming estimated 40,000 young jihadists. Why? Because those guys are credible in the eyes of the jihadists. They are the ones who killed Sadat. They are the founding fathers of modern jihad. When they come out and say, we were wrong, and for the reason 1, 2, 3, 4, and they give you the evidence from the Quran and from the practice of the Prophet, and they say to a young jihadist, you don't want to go that path, we know it and it is wrong. They succeeded in transforming so many people. I believe that there is a lot of hope in that doctrine revision process, and we need to embrace it, and we need to translate what they did. We need to promote those people who have done this work and see how we can spread this message on a wider scale. But let me emphasize again, by itself, doctrinal revision will fail if it is not accompanied by serious addressing of the grievances and serious also revision and self-criticism of how policy decisions have been made, especially in the West, to fight those issues and to also revisit the injustice that the Muslim world has lived under for so long. Thank you so much.
Any brief question of clarification for Dr. Abdallah at this time? For substantive questions, please hold them for our dialogue. Very good. Oh, yes, please.
Could you please just mention the names of some of these books or articles that is muraja'at al-fiqhiyya?
And muraja'at al-fiqhiyya. I promise I will get it out of
Question is naming some of the resources of the doctrinal revision and peacemaking resource approaches.
Yes, I will actually open my laptop and read the exact names, and I have them on PDF on my laptop, so anyone interested, maybe I can email them to you. And I want to spread them all over the world, so they are really good at it. So I will do that during the break.
Very good. At this time, I would like to invite Dr. Richard Jones forward to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Jones has been vital to the growth of this mission in Muslim-Christian dialogue and the consortium as holder of the Alwani Chair for a number of years and teacher in consortium schools. So, Dr. Jones.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Larry.
Anthony, Cecil, Eden, Quainton is known to his friends as Tony. And as we direct our minds tonight to thinking about violence in the name of religion, you should know Tony and his wife Susan are active members of a vibrant Roman Catholic parish, Church of the Annunciation, Massachusetts Avenue. Although when he and I first met, it was across the river, the refectory of the Protestant Episcopal Theological Seminary in Virginia, and he explained that he was a roaming Catholic. Tony Quainton has served as ambassador of the United States to 4 nations, including Kuwait and Central African Republic. He served in the Foreign Service of the United States in Rawalpindi and New Delhi. In the late 70s, he was in the State Department as coordinator for anti-terrorism, and in the 1990s, Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security. Ambassador Quainton has been very generous with me and the Alwani Chair in Muslim Christian Studies, offering advice, serving on the Board of Trustees of the consortium, specifically at the time when this 40-year-old, formerly all-Christian consortium admitted a new member, the Graduate School of Islamic and Social Sciences. So I can think of no one better equipped as a Christian thinker to help us reflect on religious roots of violence than the distinguished diplomat in residence, the School of International Service at American University here in Washington, Mr. Tony Quainton.
Richard, thank you for that very generous introduction. I should say that not only, and this is perhaps keeping two impossible ideas together in the mind at the same time, my wife and I are also parishioners of St. Albans Episcopal Church.
Good. Good.
And so we roam from Canterbury to Rome and back on a regular basis. I have to be quite frank in saying that I am not an academic expert on either violence or religion, but as you heard in the course of my fairly long career in the United States Foreign Service, I did serve in 2 Muslim countries, Pakistan and Kuwait, and in that complex multi-religious society, India. And on the violence side, I had the misfortune, I think that's the only way to describe it, to be the coordinator for counterterrorism in the Carter administration, and then the Assistant Secretary for Security in the Clinton administration. It's interesting that just going back to those days, that the violence we were most concerned about came from a religion in which virtually no one believes. Communism in its Marxist-Leninist iteration. However, tonight's topic is one in which I have been interested for some time as a Christian struggling with the violent challenges of the modern world. For Christians, and indeed for Muslims, the story we are considering this evening can be said to have begun in the year 1095 in Clermont, France. There, in the presence of several hundred nobles and clergy, Pope Urban II exhorted his audience to set forth on the Great Crusade to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslim Turks, to restore a Christian state in what had been for many hundred years a Muslim area. And as some of you may remember, his audience responded with the now famous cry, Deus vult, Deus vult. God wants it. God wants it. And so began an extraordinary period of bloodshed involving the deaths of thousands of Christians, both rich and poor, from all over Europe, and of thousands of victims, rich and poor, the Muslim occupiers as they were perceived of the Holy Land in the 11th and 12th centuries. And when one hears descriptions about what is promised to jihadists, it is well to remember that Pope Urban promised a place in heaven to all who would lose their lives or have the misfortune to die in the cause which the First Crusade was to carry out. And so there are some resonances here going back 1,000 years for Christians and indeed for Muslims. These far-off events have their echoes, it seems to me, in the modern call by ISIL for the reestablishment of a Muslim caliphate, and Dr. Olu has laid out much more eloquently than I ever could some of the reasons for that. But similarly, the Christians set out to establish a Christian state in and around their holy places, where Christians could be protected and their faith could be made secure. And defeating the infidel became a moral obligation for Christians then, as it is for some jihadist Muslims now. Of course, the violence between Christians and Muslims goes back indeed at least 400 years before the Crusades, as Islam advanced from its foundational homeland on the Arabian Peninsula to include all of Christian North Africa and the Middle East, as well as the Iberian Peninsula. And on the northern side of the Mediterranean, that battle continued well into the late 17th and early 18th centuries, culminating in 1698 in the famous Battle of Vienna, where the Turks were definitively turned back. And so the reconquest of former Christian lands, the Reconquista, as it came to be known in Spain, was an objective for centuries of Christian rulers, not only in Spain, but also in the Holy Roman Empire. That is a story much too long and complicated to recount here tonight. But it is well to remember that fighting between Christians and Muslims in the name of religion is not something invented by Al-Qaeda or ISIL, but has its roots deep in the history of the Western world. And even in recent times, it was exemplified by Greeks killing Turks in the aftermath of the First World War, and by the infamous Armenian massacres of 1915 and 1916. One can, of course, argue that 1,000 years of wars of religion had nothing much to do with religion, but with the secular power of Christian and Muslim rulers anxious to defend their territory and their power. So defending their faith against an enemy force that both sides considered to be made up of infidels was a secondary goal. But whatever the truth to that assertion, there is no doubt that violence in the name of religion has been with us for a very long time. And given the natural human propensity to violence, it is likely to be around for a long time to come. And I think it is well for Christians and Muslims to remember that violence in the name of religion is not just or even primarily about the competition between Islam and Christianity. Hindus and Muslims committed terrible atrocities against each other in 1947 at the time of partition. Sunnis and Shiites have fought each other in various parts of the Middle East, with each side characterizing the other as heretical. And the recent bombings just in the last weeks of Shiite mosques in Yemen and Iraq are the most recent examples. And similarly, the wars of religion which followed the Protestant Reformation, whose 500th anniversary we will celebrate or commemorate in 2017, led to some of the bloodiest battles in European history, as each side struggled to dominate the political landscape in the name of its branch of Christianity. And more recently, in the Great Lakes region of Africa, I'm told the most baptized region in the world, Christians have been fighting each other with extraordinary ferocity. Tutus versus Hutus in Rwanda, Nuer versus Dinka in South Sudan, and so on. Of course, much of this sectarian conflict, which on the surface seems to be about religion, is, as I've suggested, more often about power, about control of territory, or long festering rivalries and animosities between clans and tribes. Akbar Ahmed has written a rather fascinating book entitled The Thistle and the Drone, which some of you may know, in which he describes a struggle between central authorities and peripheral tribal centers of power. And he points out that these groups on the periphery are often religious minorities which the center seeks to control and in some cases eliminate. When many of the Christians in this room were growing up, at least in my generation, but I think even in at least one generation after that, one of the foundational hymns was "Onward, Christian Soldiers." Those soldiers were marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. That hymn is no longer in most hymnals, having been deleted to strike out the implied violent militancy of the Christian faith. Of course, the hymn does not call for war, but calls on Christians to go forth as if they were going to war, that is, with faith and conviction and commitment. Another more popular hymn, now sung with great enthusiasm by Catholics and Protestants alike, also has a martial theme. That hymn, "Lift High the Cross," exhorts Christians in the following language: "Come, brethren, follow where our captain trod, our King victorious, Christ the Son of God. Led on their way by this triumphant sign, the hosts of God in conquering ranks combine. Each newborn soldier of the crucified bears on the brow the seal of him who died. This is the sign which Satan's legions fear, and angels veil their faces to revere." The images are clear. Christ is our captain. We are exhorted to be engaged in conquering evil. Each one of us is a newborn soldier. And in the language of the modern hymn of the civil rights structure, we will overcome. The enemy is not Islam, but the devil. Although, unfortunately, there are those in this country and elsewhere who have included that Islam is satanic, with the result that this exhortation to conquer Satan's legions has been extended to the forces of jihadist Islam. Recent developments seem to suggest that we are entering a new and more virulent phase of the use of violence in the name of religion. We watch with horror the beheadings, the rapes, the torture in the name of Islam by fanatics fighting under the banner of ISIL. And we hear the call for a universal caliphate and wonder where that call might lead. And we are bemused to read of young men and women joining ISIL's cause, just as we once might have been surprised at the young men and women, many of whom were poor, but many of whom were educated, who signed up for the first crusade in 1095 and the subsequent crusades that followed. So if the history is grim and the present is awful, what are we, Christians and Muslims, to do? What is the transformation that will enable us to put behind us this propensity to violence, which seems all too evident in our respective societies and faiths? One commonly suggested solution is an intense reading and analysis of each other's scriptures. I think it is safe to say that very, very few Christians have read the Quran in its entirety. Indeed, there are very few Christians who have read the Bible in its entirety. And I suspect that most Muslims have not read the Bible, Old and New Testaments alike, from cover to cover. And while I certainly think we need more scriptural literacy and to be much better informed about each other's faith, I am not certain that a superficial reading of Scripture would solve all our problems. Both sacred texts are filled with noble and inspiring words. But if truth is to be told, both have language which calls believers to violence. There are ample examples in the Judeo-Christian tradition of how God sanctioned violence by the Jews against those who were the indigenous occupiers of the Holy Land. And Jesus explicitly stated that he has come not to bring peace, but a sword. Biblical scholars, and I'm sure many of them are here, are skillful in explaining away the violence, and I want to do that, of course. But But the truth is that outsiders reading the Old and New Testaments are not likely to come away with the picture of the totally peace-loving religion we repeatedly invoke. One of the reasons that tensions between Islam and Christianity continue to fester lies in the fundamental nature of both religions. Unlike our friends in the Buddhist or Hindu or Confucian traditions, we confidently assert that we are the possessors of the ultimate truth, revealed to us in sacred books through the words of our respective prophets. And Christians add the incarnational element of God having become man in order to reform the world and conquer sin. Both religions deeply believe in their own righteousness and in the obligation to engage in what we Christians call evangelization, the spreading of our faith to those who do not share it. And our sacred texts urge us to go forth to spread the revealed word. Unfortunately, that leaves us very little room for compromise, and where there is no compromise, violence is often the result. One might argue that in both the Christian and Muslim worlds, the process of secularization has undermined the temptation to evangelize. We are too busy making money and living the good life to propagate our faith. And indeed, followers of each religion in our society are by and large content to live peacefully within their own communities without recourse to violent proselytism. Yet the recent burning of churches in Pakistan, the abduction of Assyrian Christians in Iraq, and attacks on the Copts in Egypt and Libya suggest that we still have some distance to go before the use of violence in the name of religion can be put behind us. A recent book by Professor John Owen of the University of Virginia entitled Confronting Political Islam deals with many of these same issues and asks, how are we to confront this challenge? Professor Owen offers an answer. Be flexible, be patient, and be true to ourselves. He provides altogether reasonable advice. He argues that the key to understanding political Islam is to recognize its diversity and to deal with it according to that diversity. He calls for a containment strategy, reminiscent of George Kennan's strategy for dealing with the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the Second World War. That strategy also called for patience, not expecting rapid transformation, but waiting for the internal contradictions of the communist world to emerge. It is, of course, an open question whether there are comparable internal inconsistencies in either the Christian or the radical Islamic position, although one can clearly argue that the goals of radical Islam conflict in some degree with the modernizing forth of market-oriented capitalism, which has advanced the prosperity of millions of global citizens, including many in the Muslim world itself. How that force will impact the evolution, that secular force, will impact the evolution of Muslim thinking is far from clear. At the heart of Professor Owen's argument is the exhortation to Western societies to be true to their highest values of freedom and equality. He argues that the impact of secular societies, which has produced greater openness, greater prosperity, greater freedom, and greater well-being, will eventually undermine the most stringent and unforgiving aspects of radical jihadist Islam. That is a hope that I share. However, we must also recognize that the risk that the hedonistic and materialistic excesses of the modern Western world will in fact only engender greater resistance among Muslims, among those Muslims particularly who advocate for a purer and more disciplined society. Professor Owen does not expect a conversion of Islamists to Western values, but he argues that a convergence over time between Muslims and Christians is possible. While the victory of one side over the other is theoretically possible, it seems unlikely in our lifetime at least. The answer may indeed be to adopt a firm, consistent, and uncompromising containment, which might eventually lead to better and more peaceful relationships between political Islam and liberal democracy. It remains to be seen if that patient strategy can withstand the political pressures for more violent responses on both sides of this great debate. The calls for war against the Ayatollahs in Iran, heard in both Tel Aviv and Washington recently, should remind us that for some on our side, violence is the only real way to defeat the forces of violent political Islam. The growing polarization between radical jihadist Islam and militant forces in the West certainly raises the question about whether a gradualist approach can succeed. One can only hope that it will. Violence in the name of religion is surely not the answer. Thank you.
عصيت والذنب كبير وإني في حزني يسير مقيد بذنبي يا رب فهل أستحق يا إلهي العفو مجرما مقر بالذنوب يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي يا إلهي